Hi, this is Sonja Livingston, and I am reviewing Sarah Broom's The Yellow House today. Uh, because I am not there live, I will be working from notes, and I also don't have a PowerPoint or any visuals. So I want to ask for your patience in advance as I let you know that I'll be working from notes. I am delighted to be part of this series and to kick it off. We're doing it unusually because I'm recording from home, so I'll miss your presence and your questions. But I am proud to discuss this book as part of this series. I am a huge fan of the library and of this series. As a person who grew up in a home without a lot of books, I would certainly not be the writer that I am today without the library system, and particularly without the downtown library. So again, I thank you for allowing me to review the book. So in particularly this book, which I'd heard so much about before I was invited to review it. The Yellow House by Sarah Broom was published in 2019, and there was a lot of buzz about this book in the writing world. People were already talking about it before it was out. And so I was excited already, but because I knew it was a memoir of place, and I am a writer of place, I was particularly interested in this book. So I'm going to introduce myself very briefly and just say I'm Sonja Livingston. I am a writer. I have written 4 books of creative nonfiction or memoir. The first book, Ghost Bread, described growing up as one of 7 children in a single parent family in Northeast Rochester and parts of Western New York. And the latest book is an essay collection called The Virgin of Prince Street, which also looks at place, specifically the old Corpus Christi Church in Rochester, but uses that as a way to sort of springboard an exploration of contemporary Catholicism. But about this book, I should also say that I'm a professor of writing at Virginia Commonwealth University. So I write memoir and nonfiction, and I also teach it. And again, that made me particularly excited about this book, which is described. This is the brief description from the publisher. In 1961, Sarah Broom's mother, Ivory May, bought a shotgun house in the then promising neighborhood of New Orleans East, and she built her world inside of it. It was the height of the space race, and the neighborhood was home to a major NASA plant. The post-war optimism seemed assured. Widowed, Ivory May remarried Sarah's father, Simon Broom. Their combined family would eventually number 12 children. But when Simon died 6 months after Sarah's birth, the Yellow House would become Ivory May's 13th and most unruly child. Well, the book, like as I think I said, was published in August of 2019, but it began really to be conceived of in 2005 when Katrina hit New Orleans. Sarah Broom was already a writer then. She'd completed college and she was working for Oprah magazine, and she'd already published. And so beginning in 2005, this project was discussed and agented and became a reality. But Sarah Broom, the writer, says that the project began much earlier. As a child, she listened very attentively and took notes. And when she left New Orleans East to attend college in Denton, Texas, she began to take notes and very quickly realized as a student of journalism and writing that this was a book project for her. So my point is that this book, while published recently, was really decades in the making. An early excerpt of the work was published in the New Yorker in 2015, and when it was finally published as a book in August of 2019, like I say, it created a lot of buzz in the writing world. It received positive attention in a pre-publication review. The New York Times wrote, "This is a major book that will come to be considered among the essential memoirs of this vexing decade." The New York Times book review called it an instant essential text. The Star Tribune said that Broom's book had essentially told the story of Black America in one fell swoop. And quoting the book, Kirkus Reviews said that The Yellow House reflected the author's attempt to, quote, reckon with the psychic cost of defining oneself by the place where you are from, end quote, adding that Broom's lyrical style celebrates her family bonds, but a righteous fury runs throughout the narrative at New Orleans' injustices from the foundation on up. The book was named one of the 10 best by the New York Times Book Review. It was on many of the best of lists for 2019, including President Obama's list of favorite books. Also in 2019, it won the National Book Award for Nonfiction. In accepting the award, Broom said, quote, I am in this room, and so is my mother and my siblings, whose voices exist in mine, end quote. I think that's a good way to start talking about this book, which is clearly Sarah's voice, but also does contain the voice of her mother, Ivory May, her grandmother, her siblings, and her people, really. She's writing about place, but place and people, as we'll see in this book, really are the same thing. You cannot separate place and people. So the first thing that I want to say is that this is a big book. It's physically a big book. It's 372 pages, and by today's standards, that's fairly long for a memoir. But not only is it physically big, she's handling some big concepts. As you've probably already heard, she's writing about a very big family, 12 children, and extended family with cousins and aunts and uncles. But each of those characters is pretty big. So she's got lots of personalities here, lots of family members. She's writing about a big place. New Orleans looms large in the imagination, and I'll come back to this idea. But she's also, probably most importantly, writing about very big ideas. She's writing about place and people, but she's also writing about class. She's writing about race. She's writing the story of America in a way, and is doing so by looking at one house and the people it held in one neighborhood. So the place that she's writing about, I want to very quickly say, is New Orleans East. And that's a portion of New Orleans which is beyond what people tend to think about as the city. It's separated from New Orleans proper by the Industrial Canal. It was built on lowland, swampland. Lots of New Orleans is lowland and watery, but this particular place in 1959 was developed and drained. Again, I'll come back to this idea, but it's a place that her mother could afford to buy a house in the 1960s as a 19-year-old widow. She was already widowed and had children and was 7 months pregnant when she bought this house. So Broom gives us a history of this place, how it was developed. She tells us about hurricanes Betsy and then Katrina. But what she wants us to know is that while those hurricanes, and especially Katrina, were massively important, the history of the place and how it was developed and the land itself is important in ways that go beyond those events. She says, Sarah Broom says, quote, I made no distinction then or now between the house, my family, the street, New Orleans East, New Orleans, or America. Those were all the same subject to me, end quote. So this, again, gets to the idea of just how large the book and how expansive it is. I think that its expansiveness is both a strength and a challenge. Broom manages the largeness and the sort of scope, the wide scope, by structuring the book into 3 very distinct sections. And the sections function almost like rooms in a house. She uses the yellow house to talk about many things, as we'll see, but the book itself almost has 3 rooms. And in talking to people, I find that some people really love the first room, which is the history of New Orleans East and the family. The second room tends to be more of a traditional memoir, written very lyrically, in which we hear the details of young Sarah's life. And then the third section is also a sort of traditional memoir, and where we hear about the writer Sarah Broom returning to New Orleans. This is vastly oversimplifying. The point point is that each of these sections comes at the subject beautifully, but differently. So the writing style shifts dramatically from journalistic approach to lyrical memoir to ethnography, history, geography. Sometimes we get present tense voice, other times past. The perspective and point of view shifts. In this way, it's a layered and rich work of nonfiction. It's called memoir, but it's really, I think that's maybe not the best label for it. It's just that we don't have probably an appropriate label. It's really a hybrid work of nonfiction. She says, again, quote, I started with a family timeline. In 1914, X happened. Then I layered on top of the family timeline, the city timeline. Then I layered on top of the city timeline, American history and the history of New Orleans East. Because Broom's work is so sweeping, I won't be able to go through all of it, but I just wanted to point out a few things as a writer and teacher of memoir and creative nonfiction. The first thing is that I am going to call this a memoir, even though I said it doesn't neatly fit that category, but as a memoir, I think it exists as a corrective. And what I mean by that is that people write memoirs for many reasons. Maybe they're famous or something dramatic or important happened to them. Maybe they overcame adversity. I think we really like those sort of memoirs where people write about where they came from and how they sort of overcame a particular thing. And that's fine. And certainly this book has that element, although she doesn't focus on it very much. I think the focus of this book really is to correct our vision. It is to serve as a sort of corrective lens for the culture. And what I mean by that, and I'll use my own example very quickly. I did not write my first book, Ghost Bread, because I thought that I had a remarkable life or that I'd overcome anything or anything really important that I needed to put my story out there. I actually was motivated to write because I met people who were not native Rochesterians usually, but who would say things like, what do you mean you grew up in the inner city? Or what do you mean you had an outhouse in Orleans County? Or Indian reservation, you lived on an Indian reservation, what were the teepees like? So there was a vast gulf between my experience of the world lived and what people seem to understand. And so what motivated me as a writer is that I wanted to share, which I think we all do, we want to be known. I wanted my people and places to be better understood. And that is, I believe, what motivates Sarah Broom. And before I say that, I will say that I often ask my writing students to write about their places. They often in nonfiction or memoir, they think, oh, I'm going to come in here, I'm going to write about the time that I broke up with my boyfriend, or, the time that I drank too much and I overcame that addiction. And those are fine stories, but I don't want them to start there. I tell them to write or ask them to write about where they're from. They fear this will be boring, but the truth is where we come from and how and where we started in the world is important. This is particularly true for my students from the South because those places have been largely misunderstood, disregarded, or stereotyped. But it's true for any of us. So Broom is writing about New Orleans. And if I were there with you, I would say, think for a minute about New Orleans. So I'll just say it on video. Think for a minute. When you think of New Orleans, what comes to mind? I suppose now Katrina, but often in the imagination, the American imagination, we think of gumbo, maybe we think of pralines, maybe that's just me, I love food, so I think of those things, but maybe you think of the French Quarter or Voodoo or the Cathedral, but it's a city that we certainly have ideas about. It's a big city, like the book. It lives large in the American imagination. In fact, I have a quote here from Tennessee Williams. He says, America has only 3 cities, New York, San Francisco, and New Orleans. Everywhere else is Cleveland. I really like Cleveland, but there's that idea, right? And Mark Twain said, an American has not seen the United States until he's seen Mardi Gras in New Orleans. And finally, Anne Rice wrote, in the spring of 1988, I returned to New Orleans, and as soon as I smelled the air, I knew I was home. It was rich, almost sweet, like the scent of jasmine and roses around our old courtyard. I walked the streets, savoring that long-lost perfume. Well, those are certainly true for the writers, but in their lovely images and cool ideas. But this is not Broom's New Orleans. She's not writing about the city that you or I know. She's writing about a place east of the tourism, separated from the city by this canal that I mentioned. And there are many complaints about the memoir as a genre, how it can seem self-absorbed or whiny, but the real power of the genre and why I feel so strongly about it is that people and places on the margins of society are suddenly given a voice or a flashlight. They're illuminated. Sarah Broom writes a memoir of her life, but in fact, her greater accomplishment is the light that she shines on the people and this place that most of us don't know. And in fact, maybe worse than not knowing, we have a real misconception about. So Broom's particular take on place, how does she give us her New Orleans? Well, she starts with a map. This is from the first section of the book. Quote, on a detailed map once given to me by Avis Rent-A-Car, the French Quarter has been shaded in light turquoise, magnified in a box at the bottom of the page. New Orleans East is cut off, a point beyond, a blank space on someone's mental map. So she starts with this very strong image. She's got a map of the city, her city, but her part of the city isn't even on it. She continues in that introduction to give directions to the yellow house of the book's title, aka 4121 Wilson Avenue. She says, after another 4 miles, you'll arrive at the bridge we call the High Rise for the dramatic arc it makes over the industrial canal that connects the Mississippi River to Lake Pontchartrain, but exiles eastern New Orleans from the rest of the city. Being at the top of the high rise feels like resting on the verge of discovery, but the descent is cruel and steep. And she goes on in her introduction to give very precise instructions. Exit suddenly as Chef Montour. Drive 1 mile in the far right lane. You'll go by Causey's Country Kitchen. And I'll stop there, otherwise I could keep going because it's sort of a lovely introduction and also a smart introduction. She is taking the reader by the hand and saying, look, I want to show you something, and I'll tell you how to get there because the maps are not going to tell you. So that's what I'm going to do, and that's largely what the real strength of this book is. After situating us in place or space, Broom gives us her people, her grandma Lolo, Miss Octavia, the next door neighbor, her mother's first husband, who dies as a teenager, Broom's father, Simon Broom, who also dies when she's a baby. But first and foremost, we get her mother, Ivory May, who manages to buy the small house when she's only 19, 7 months pregnant, and already widowed by her first husband. Broom gives us each of her 11 siblings and aunts and uncles and cousins, about 100 years of relatives in all. And this lends to the sweeping quality, as I've said. Because Broom uses place to talk about people and the people to talk about place, it's important to her that we understand how this part of New Orleans began, how this swampy lowlands was developed as a model city, and how that model city collapses, literally and figuratively over time. This house that Ivory May buys in 1964 for $3,200 is everything to her. Broom writes in the book, quote, her attraction to the narrow, pale structure was nothing resembling love. It was more like dreaming, end quote. From the beginning, it was sinking already. The house was uneven. It was not on sturdy foundation. But Ivory May moves in and works on the house. She paints it. She buys new furniture. She puts carpets in. It's her pride and joy. It's everything. It's possibility for Ivory May. It's a place she can make beautiful. Using the yellow house to talk about things like beauty and possibility, as well as race and class and despair, is powerful. As I've said, the house is a stand-in for many things. First, hope, but eventually, over time, as Ivory May loses her husband, his income, his ability to fix the house up, eventually the house becomes a stand-in for other things, such as shame and despair and being stuck. Again, we tend to focus on people in our memories and stories, but the structures we build matter. And Sarah Broom focusing on this yellow house reminds us of this fact. The memoir is clearly about things other than the yellow house. The yellow house is how we get to talk about those things, or she gets to talk about those things, or we get to learn about them. So another point of the memoir is that exterior and interiors are important, as I've said, the structures, but Broom focuses on how things look from the outside and how things actually are from the inside. That's a really important theme in the book. She's interested in how people become their places, as I've said, but there's also this focus on how things look. Her mother, for instance, likes food based on how it looks. So she likes to present food that looks beautiful. And actually Broom says she won't even eat food if it doesn't look right. Her mother, Lolo, the grandmother in the book, was very focused on how people dressed, having their hair just right. And again, this thread sort of continues throughout. Ivory May, that's Sarah's mother, makes the children's clothes and curtains for the house, even for the cars. How things appear to the outside world matters to her. If you hold your head high and do your hair up, then you'll be treated with respect. You'll be seen to matter. Ivory May's children take this on. They learn to dress well, to speak well. They're very well mannered. In fact, so much so that they begin to outshine the yellow house, which, as I said, is falling in shambles over time. This tension between how people and places look versus how they truly are is really important to the book. After Simon Broom dies, and the house is no longer cared for physically, Ivory May cares for it as best she can. She keeps it very clean. She's constantly making it beautiful, or trying to. But plants begin to creep in through the cracks of the house. Rats move into the kitchen. Holes that were small to begin with and just needed a little bit of filling begin to widen over time. So the promise of this house, the dream, the shiny interiors that were new at first, really lose that appeal. Also, outside of the house, we have Hurricane Betsy, white flight, poverty, crime. So this place that was once seen as a model city, New Orleans East, becomes a place ridden with crime. We see the corruption by police and local authorities. Throughout the book, Broom repeats the line that her mother, Ivory May, always said growing up. You know, this house not all that comfortable for other people. We hear that time and time again. This house not all that comfortable for other people. By the time Sarah's a child, the girls do not invite people over. The house that had once been Ivory May's pride and joy is now really a shame. They don't use the word shame, but the girls, not only do they not have their friends over, if they're dropped, if they're given a ride home by somebody at church or school, they ask those people to drop them off a block away or something, just to avoid having their home be seen. So her sister says, the kind of people we were made it worse. Because of the way Mama made us look, people began to have expectations. It's better to look homely if you live in a house like that. So again, there's this focus on the fact that they looked so good, and yet the house is falling apart. How can we make sense of these two things? As someone who grew up in a series of ugly places, I found this part of the book very relatable. I also remember getting dropped off on the corner so that people wouldn't have to see the broken shingles of our houses. In this way, Sarah Broom articulates the experience that many may not think about, but which poor kids often feel. That is, having the shame sink in and take over and be a part, really, of the very structure, which is to you also the safest place in the world, which holds your family. That is home. So again, that tension of home being beautiful, where the family lives, where you can be yourself, but also a place that you know just doesn't seem to be as good as what other people have. It's a lot more than that. This is a book that looks at home and place from many different angles. But this is a thread that I found particularly resonant. Home is ultimately what Sarah Broom is concerned with. The house at 3121 Wilson in East New Orleans, after the levees are breached in 2005 and the water rises with Katrina, the house is split in two. It cracks along the sides. Broom describes, by then the kids have grown up and moved away, and Broom herself is living in New York. But she describes how her brother Carl still shows up after the house is destroyed, cares for the lot, and in fact, he even the house is wiped clean away, but first by Katrina, which shakes it. Its foundation was never good, but Katrina really gives it the final punch. But then a year later, Broom describes how the city of New Orleans demolishes the house along with hundreds of others without really notifying the family. So there's some bad feelings about that. But once the house is clean, wiped away, and it's just a lot, the brother Carl not only comes and mows that lawn and takes care of whatever remains, he actually sets up a dining room table and chairs and invites people over. So there's a sense of his physically just hanging on to the space for as long as he can and caretaking. So he makes it a place. He keeps watch over it, following his mother, Ivory May's example, to do the best with what you have. This is beauty, taking care of it, elevate it. The last section of the book describes the author returning after Katrina, and it becomes a meditation on those who leave and those who stay, and the complicated feelings about all of these things. Sarah Broom writes, quote, "Who has the rights to the story of a place? Are these rights earned, bought, fought, died for? Are they given? Are they automatic, like an assumption, self-renewing? Are these rights a token of citizenship belonging to those who stay in the place or to those who leave and come back? Does the act of leaving relinquish one's rights to the story? Who stays gone? Who can afford to return?" In the case of New Orleans, these questions really matter. With people who fled Katrina still no longer able to afford to come back to these places, what Sarah Broom has written there, these questions, who stays gone, who can afford to return, again, have particular resonance. That city since 2005 has changed. People who may want to come back, native New Orleanians, can no longer afford to. Wealthier, often whiter people have moved in, and the rents are so high that those old neighborhoods, which were their homes, are no longer theirs. And so this idea of how people form place and how place form people, again, runs throughout the book. Sarah Broom said in an interview that when the house was demolished, as I said, first by Katrina, but then the city, she felt like something had broken inside of her and it would never be the same. Now, this is despite the fact that she had mixed feelings about this house. Again, it was home, but it was also this place that she feared and was ashamed of. She'd be a girl in her bedroom listening to the rats in the kitchen and be afraid of that, or somebody breaking in, often her brother, who was a drug addict, to steal something to sell so that he would have money. So this was both a safe place and not a safe place. And yet when it's removed, when the yellow house is removed from this world, she has feelings of loss. And this makes sense. The book focuses a great deal on this sort of sense of place and displacement. It reads like an elegy in some ways to that little house in New Orleans East and to the people, most of them no longer there. And yet Sarah Broom's memoir tells us they were there. This place mattered to them, but more importantly, they mattered to the place. The same way her grandma Lolo elevated the family by teaching them good manners and how to dress, and Ivory May did by buying the little yellow house and trying to make it into something, and her brother Carl does by keeping watch of the place, even after the house itself is gone. Broom continues this family tradition with her book, which not only challenges and widens our view of important issues such as place and class and race, urban development, but she does these things while elevating these subjects and revealing their beauty too. if you can't tell already, highly recommend this book. I think, as I said earlier, those three sections each have their own flavor and style, and I appreciated all three of them. I think even though if you only found yourself connected to one of them, this book would be worth the price of the book and the time it takes to read it, because, as I talked about earlier, Sarah Broom is correcting our vision. She's saying, you think you know New Orleans, let me show you my New Orleans, and let me show you why this particular place matters. And from that, she lets us know why other place matters. That's the power of memoir, that I can tell my story, Sarah Broom can tell her story, you can tell your story, and we get our views widened. We know about other places, but in that way, we know more about ourselves as a culture, as Americans, and as human beings. So I thank you again for the opportunity to review this book. It's written beautifully. I highly recommend it. If I were there, I would be so happy to be taking your questions right now. Maybe there's a way to post questions or comments on Facebook, and if there is a way to do that through the book sandwiched in site, I will be happy to respond to them and continue this conversation. Until then, thank you very much.